Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Maybe Mindful podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Mae. And this week, I wanted to highlight the topic, which I've highlighted it before, but a different facet of it, the empath, and really the role of the empath, the purpose and role as it is integral, I believe, with the greater healing of the collective, and the history of the empath, because it's a new term coined, I think, in the mid 50s, like 1950s, that originated in some book. I don't really know much about that. But it's a new term that's now become recognized in the field of psychology. Judith Orloff has written a ton about it. She's a empath, self-proclaimed clairvoyant, and psychiatrist who has helped a lot of people with this. She wrote a book called, I think it's like The Survival Guide or something. I read it a while ago. It was actually, there's some good tools in there because these people who identify as empaths do need to learn and build in some very good solid boundaries and guardrails for helping them to navigate what is considered sort of the sixth sense of being a more highly sensitive individual, which is also a term or a phrase that's synonymous with empath, in being more perceptive to other people's feelings, thoughts, emotions, and in fact, really feeling them and embodying them in their own body, even if they don't recognize it or realize it or have not made that distinction. And of course, in my other episode where I talked about this, I talk about the crossover and sometimes the confusion around what is what and, childhood trauma, codependency, hypervigilance, which are oftentimes qualities that an empath will have as a result of maybe trauma, but that's not what defines them or makes them an empath. And so, sometimes people get those confused, I think, and then they rely on the term empath as like a get out of jail free card from having to do their own work and just say like, well, oh, I'm an empath, so that's why I feel this way. But I do believe that we get to take ownership of these gifts because I think they're gifts and we get to take responsibility for them. And there is a purpose for them. And so part of this gifting, a lot of times it's associated with, like deeper intuition, sometimes clairvoyance, sometimes telepathy. It can manifest differently for different people, but everybody is gifted according to their divinely aligned purpose in this life, I believe. So it makes sense, and it is a gift, but like with all gifts, we do have to learn how to properly to understand them, to channel them, and how to use them, and therefore how to be a channel. And part of the whole thing with being an empath is that you are, in fact, you become a channel sometimes and a vessel for other people's shit. And it's like, that's why sometimes it can feel for people until they've learned how to do this, it can really feel like a curse. So I did talk and touch on that a little bit in the other episode, but I really want to talk about the history of it as well, because we've seen people throughout history that would have been identified as such or would have identified as such. I'm going to mainly talk about it from the saints and the mystics, but of course there have been different healers, leaders, social reformers who have had deep compassion that have been able to create incredibly profound transformation and change and elevate the vibration of the world, the collective consciousness, in order like through their compassion, through their gifting and being able to hold space for, see, embody, feel, understand, relate to the suffering of humanity. And when we can relate to the suffering of humanity, just as in as a parent, if they're going to help their child transform a negative feeling state, when we show up and are simply present to it and have compassion for it and hold space for it, it allows that child to transform that negative feeling and dissolve that, integrate with it, and then be restored to their happy, joyful selves. So can somebody who has this particular set of gifting when they learn how to use it. And it's not just used selfishly, or we're not operating from like an unwell place with it. And our gifts aren't hurting us, because I do believe our gifts, like the greater they are, the more ability, in fact, they have to cause us harm, then we can really be a part of some incredible transformation on the planet. And I believe that we are being ushered into and are in process of this, in fact, a time of healing, transformation, and healing can be a little messy. And so that's what I believe we're witnessing is we're watching people wake up. We're watching people stay asleep. We're watching so much schism and divide as a result of it within. We're seeing a lot of projection of people's unawarenesses and where they're still asleep going kind of out onto everyone else. And therefore, there is this extreme polarization. I mean, you see it politically, right? Right now, things feel like the collective has taken a deep sigh and a breath. And so it feels like there is a peace at the moment, which I believe is partially to really create space for us to rest, regenerate, and become stronger so that we can move into with greater power whatever is unfolding and coming up next. I don't know what that is, but spiritually speaking, I believe we are moving into some pretty profound uh, stuff, I'll call it, because I don't know what else to call it in this moment. So, as far as the role, I believe that we are all co-creators, first of all, and we're called to utilize our gifts in creating, right? We are the children of a creator, whatever you conceive or perceive that creator to be. Therefore, we are by our birthright creators. And the design is really fascinating to me. Like when you look at, if you look at any of Bruce Lipton's work in epigenetics, and he wrote a really cool book called that is hard to get through because it's a little science based and like my mind sort of I can't reiterate any of it, but I understood it. I was able to embody the information like on a cellular level. It was really profound. Um, but when you look at this idea that we are the architects, we've been given charge over our own inner universe. And we can activate our genes, for example. And this is pretty incredible because it means we can turn things off, we can turn things on. And, he gives the example of how only like 50% of women who have whatever the primary cancer, breast cancer gene is, how only 50% of those women actually get breast cancer. So it's not the gene, it's more environmental. So it's a predisposition, but that predisposition is not in fact the determining factor, it's our environment. And so how we basically create our own inner and dictate our own inner environment based off of our thought life as the architects of our kingdom, our own inner kingdom. And, I really align with the kingdom of God is within, the kingdom of heaven is within. We are each ourselves a universe, and we are able to access that within each other. And that's pretty evident if you are somebody that experiences or identifies, you'll know what I'm talking about because when you can feel and embody something that's not in fact yours, and a lot of times and this was my experience, in fact, like empaths have to understand a lot of the burdens that they're carrying, in fact, aren't theirs, didn't originate in them. They are, in fact, burdens that they're carrying for others. Now, we don't have to carry those burdens. And it's a great relief to know that, to learn that, and to have boundaries around it, to be able to give ourselves permission to let it go. But that's why a lot of times most empaths, I think, generally err on the side of introversion, because although some are extroverts, I think generally speaking, we need the separation from all the many energy fields that we come into contact with. And Judith Orloff actually, I think one of the things that I took away from that book that was the most helpful for me was that she talks about a way to test if something's yours or not. If you're feeling something that doesn't feel good to you, you can move away, like move at least 20 feet away from that person and their energy field, because we all conduct electromagnetic energy. We all have a field around us. Move away from that and see what happens. See if it shifts, see if it diminishes. And if it does, then that was something of theirs. I've experienced it when I've been around a person who I'll give one example of somebody that I know that's really highly strung, that has a lot of anxiety. And whenever I'm around them, I start to feel short of breath. and and I didn't understand why for the longest time, and then I learned, like, oh, I'm actually just taking on their stuff. I'm feeling it in my body, and that's good to know because then I can have a boundary around it and I can get filled up so that I don't have to worry about that pouring in. And I know that if I go into a situation full, and this is the best antidote and solution for me in my own practice, if I go in and I have a series of things and practices that I do to fill up, to secure myself and safeguard my energy, I'm going to go in full, and there's not going to be a whole lot of room as long as I keep my conscious awareness and attention on presence within and staying filled up with that. I can make it through like pretty squeaky clean, although that does require some endurance, like building of endurance in order to do that, because a lot of times empaths forget themselves, and then what happens is they can get washed away by all the stuff that might be coming at them, and if they're in a situation that's particularly toxic or overwhelming, it can be pretty devastating, and so there's really a need to honor oneself, set up boundaries, be able to have the option to remove yourself from those spaces, and then to be really honest with yourself about what you subject yourself to based on your current, like, spiritual, and energetic litmus, like, to test, like, "Okay, where am I at? How grounded am I? How solid am I? Am I in a place of love? Am I in a place of service and compassion? Am I" but not the kind of compassion that allows you to lose yourself and over-identify with somebody else's stuff as yours, because when you over-identify with their stuff as yours, then you've lost your, connection to your own identity. And that's not good. Like, that's never good, and that's when things can feel confusing. And for the person who's like that, my own experience was is I would oftentimes I wouldn't understand how I could go from feeling one way to feeling a totally different way and then losing touch with that part of myself. But when I learned how to have these boundaries and put certain practices in place, it's helped immensely. And I've had a lot of really cool visualizations, meditations that have come in for me that have been spiritually inspired in my own meditations and my own personal intimate communication with my higher power that have helped me to really have a different experience. And those are things that spirit has brought me directly that have helped me immensely that nobody else really could have offered. So, there's a lot of people that can offer really great tools, but at the end of the day, I think as far as a solution, we do have to seek the solution that really resonates and aligns for us, because not everything that everybody offers is going to resonate. Somebody might not align for you spiritually or in other ways. And their words might not be impactful for you. So I believe that, people that are empaths are more spiritually sensitive. And this is indicative in the lives of the saints. And when we look at this idea of the victim's soul, this is not a phrase or a concept that we really hear about today. So somebody who unites their suffering, who is willing to, in alignment with and in emulation of, as far as the saints were concerned, Christ's quality of love, agape, sacrificial love, in order to be a part of healing of humanity, really, and being willing to be a vessel in order to transmute those things. We do it in a small way when we show up and we're willing to hold space for somebody and just be present with, have compassion for. We hold space for in ourselves for that person to transmute their own pain, their own suffering. And so I just find it really interesting, this idea of the victim's soul, and they became willing participants in being vessels for transmuting the suffering and the sin of mankind and the darkness that was in others. And they were clear enough to be able to hold space enough. They were clear of their own will. So there's a death of self involved, the part that wants to come into conflict with the spiritual higher self and get its own physical or carnal desires met, right? Versus elevating to things of the spirit, which of course we're always going to have that dance of the ego. But that death of self that was required in order for them to be channels for this. And so, this is somebody that in this context, in the context of saints and mystics, of course, there have been other incredibly profoundly impactful empaths on civilization and society. They were in alignment with what St. Paul said from Galatians. And he says, I have become crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And so this is indicative to the journey of the spiritual path. When we eliminate self and attachments, then we create room for the presence of the divine to live within us. We literally embody that. We embody that presence, and we are able to participate in healing in a unique way. But there is incredible suffering and passion in that. I also just want to read the root of the word empathy and its origin. The word empathy comes from the Greek word empathia, which means physical affection or passion. Empathia is derived from the Greek words en, which is in or at, and pathos, suffering with passion. The other thing I think is really interesting is a lot of times empaths experience life more intensely because they are hypersensitive. And so likewise, they can experience intense suffering more, especially when they're like identifying with or just having compassion on the suffering of humanity when they see that. And that can inspire great compassion and inspire a lot of change. And it can be very good. It can serve a wonderful purpose. It also connects humanity and it connects people with each other when they feel seen and heard, of course. But they also can experience things in a more elative way. And I think that's really the double-edged sword of it when it comes to our human experience of it. And also being able to be more predisposed to spiritually elative experiences like ecstasies, like a lot of the saints experienced ecstasies. They're very euphoric states. A lot of times, not always, but visions can be associated with them. It usually results from deep contemplation and being transported spiritually above yourself, beyond the world, to a more expansive place of spirit versus the limited, finite understanding of the mind and the darkened perception and the limitations, physical limitations of the human body. And so you look at some of the mystics and the saints specifically, and there's been thousands of them, but the ones that bore the stigmata, which were the marks of the wounds of Christ on their hands, their feet, sometimes the head, shoulder, side wound. Different saints were blessed, if you will, with different wounding. And, it's funny because I had a conversation about this and a lot of people don't know about this phenomenon, and it is a spiritual phenomenon. And they said, oh no, I hope that it doesn't ever happen to me. And I laughed and I was like, well, no, it's not like it just lands on you like bird poop. It's not like this accident. These people sought to do this. It was an offering of love where they sacrificed themselves in order to be to be co-redeemers, to transform, to mitigate the suffering of others, to transform and transmute the suffering of mankind. And when people are elevated to this higher vibrational frequency, they in fact carry a lot through them. And they can do so with love without having to identify with it, so without it having to get the better of them. But it is a state of suffering. But these victim souls, as they called it, they were not, the victim has a connotation of like self-indulgence or self-pity, but these souls actually intentionally offered themselves up as co-redeemers in order to suffer in union with, in order to be a part of the transformation of the collective during usually very dark times. St. Catherine of Siena bore the stigmata, to my knowledge, invisibly. And they would say, well, how do we know that she really bore it? It became visible and apparent. Her wounds became apparent at her time of death. She was also incredibly renowned and well-known. She was pulled in and involved in papal politics for her wisdom. She had a lot of miracles. Any of the canonized saints had at least 3 documented public miracles around their lives, and also usually after death. There were usually a slew of miracles and healings around their death and afterwards. Saint Teresa of Avila, who has a lot of well-known works like the Interior Castle that are considered spiritual masterpieces. She had the stigmata. Padre Pio was a mystic, and he had the stigmata for over 50 years where he bled profusely. St. Francis of Assisi is also a really well-known one. St. Gemma, I actually haven't done much research on her, but St. Francis is incredibly well-known, and he has that incredible prayer that is really one of the foundational prayers in 12-step. Let me see if I can pull it up and read it to you. If you don't know it, it's so beautiful. And it says, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring love. Where there is offense, let me bring pardon. Where there is discord, let me bring union. Where there is error, let me bring truth. Where there is doubt, let me bring faith. Where there is despair, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, let me bring your light. Where there is sadness, let me bring your joy. O Master, let me seek not so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that one receives, it is in self-forgetting that one finds, it is in pardoning that one is pardoned, it is in dying that one is raised to eternal life. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, interestingly, was medically scrutinized and evaluated over and over again. And because he only died in, I believe, the 70s, early 1970s, we actually have footage, documented footage of him saying mass, and he was in a good amount of pain most of the time. But there's footage of this so that there's like proof. It's not just like some legend or story. And this is all documented actually with all of the saints, but there's actual visual documentation of it. And there was no scientific explanation for it. They scrutinized and scrutinized and examined, and there was no medical explanation for it in the end because it was completely mystical. So, what is the purpose? How does that relate to being an empath? Because I'm talking about extreme cases, people that are highly elevated and involved humans. Is sainthood something achievable by anybody? Yes, I believe that to be pure, to be rid of self is achievable and free for everybody if people are willing to seek and do that work, to dip into our shadows, to resolve the things that block us, to make our way through the wreckage, to access higher power, God within. Yes, however, we're not all cut out to bear the stigmata. It's not something I personally am going to intentionally opt in for unless I become seriously holy in the next, I don't know, whenever. And who knows, right? But as it is right now, I'm pretty challenged. So as an empath, we feel things more deeply. There has to be a purpose and a reason for this, right? And so, like I was saying, we have the ability to show up and help people transmute their pains simply by being present to it. And actually, Gabor Mate, he talks about like how the most effective therapeutic approach is not the person that offers the most tools and suggestions. It's the person that actually can just be present, to witness and be present your suffering. That is the thing that has been shown to help people transform their stuff more than anything else. I know this to be true from working with clients. I know this to be true from working with my children. And I have the opportunity of doing that quite often because I have 6 children. The reason why, and also being in the healing field that I'm in, the reason why that sort of put me on the fast track to healing when I became a hypnotist is because you can only help someone really to the degree that you have healed yourself. You can only hold space for something if it's not coming into conflict. If you haven't resolved something and somebody else's stuff comes into your field, it's going to touch on something in you that's unresolved. It's going to reflect it back to you. And that's going to be the thing that's going to be paramount that you're going to have to address. And so if you are somebody that is in the healing field or just with your own kids or in your daily life. And you're being called to that, to serve in that way, which I actually believe we all are in our own unique individual way. Since I believe we heal through each other, then to whatever degree that you're called to support in healing is the degree that you're going to have to show up for yourself and get clear on that stuff, because otherwise, how much space can you actually hold for it? Not to mention, when you do pass through your own suffering and you transform your own traumas or wounding and you heal that stuff, you have vastly expanded deep compassion for others in their pain and in their suffering. Um, if you have not healed it, it could very easily manifest as, what's the word? Oh, countertransference. That's when, for example, a therapist overly identifies with the client's problem, wants to fix it for them, right? Which nobody can fix your problems for you. This is everybody's job to do within themselves. And it's a very unhealthy practice. So they end up overly identifying with it. It's very common in therapeutic settings, in any kind of healing, in the healing world in general. And it takes, I think, a pretty aware and healed person to be able to effectively support somebody else in their healing and growth. And we can only help somebody and support somebody to the degree that we are resolved and healed. And wherever we're not, it's going to present that information and it's going to show us what needs to be worked on, what needs to be fine-tuned within ourselves so that we can continue to be clear, to be a vessel. And that's the whole point. And when we do this work and we understand and learn how to channel our gifts properly, we have a part and a role in healing the collective, because so many people are suffering. And so what is needed for that suffering? There's deep compassion needed. There is the need to be seen. I mean, to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, to be validated is usually what the child is needing. And once they are, and they feel acknowledged, then they're able to resolve their own issues and move forward. Having said all of this, well, how do you do this? Well, I believe that we're spiritual beings, so we have to deepen our spiritual experience. Like, that's all there is to it. As we are mind, body, and soul, we have to address all aspects of ourselves accordingly. And each one impacts the other and our overall balance and homeostasis and in our ecosystem and condition. And this is what we have been given charge over. This is what we have authority over, is ourselves. We do not have authority over somebody else's condition. We can impact it. We can make a difference. We can support. But each person, this is each person's relationship that they have to develop for themselves, with themselves. And so I think to seek a deeper spiritual connection is really the foundation of this work. And I notice this with teens and children in particular. They have a heightened spiritual sensitivity. There is less in their little short span of life that they've lived thus far. There is less baggage, usually less layers and walls of protection that they've built up. And if they have had, in the situations where I've seen them being raised in a home that really respects and acknowledges their sensitivity instead of discarding it, dismissing it, which unfortunately for the empath is a lot of their experiences. And then, they really have to learn how to do that for themselves, which is part of their journey. And that's okay, because that's tools that they needed. And that's compassion, like I was saying, that can be deepened. But for children that have been raised in a really nurturing environment with this, they are, I mean, these kids are going to be the people that change this world, I believe, and are going to be so profoundly healing and transformative to others by their pure love. It's really, really incredible. So children that are born into that, who are born into really aware, awake situations, even if their families don't totally understand them, but they really have a respect and a reverence for their experience and their sensitivity, it's such a gift. So I think it's really good and important awareness to have, to be able to support our youth and our children in order to help them nurture their gifts, because they are a part of the new world and deep healing that this planet is in desperate need of. So I hope this was informative and helpful. And I love you guys, and I'll see you next time. Mwah.